I'm Andy Kesson, and this is A Bit Lit. Founded at the beginning of the UK lockdown, A Bit Lit is about conversation, celebrating and exploring theatre, literature and creative work across all periods and of all kinds. We've talked to professional wrestlers and about Ghostbusters and medieval sex positivity. We've looked at the histories of race, gender and sexuality. We followed migrating coconuts and the history of wine and cheese. We've gone from Jane Austen and Shakespeare to EastEnders via the history of early television, young adult fiction, photography, animation and documentary making. And with over 100 films already, many other subjects as well. Join the conversations at our website, abitlit.co, or on YouTube, and follow us on Twitter @abitlit.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi,
Thanks so much for joining us.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this discussion of disappearing things coming out of your latest book. But before we get going, would you like to perhaps introduce yourself and say a little bit about what it is that you do and what you research?
Sure. So my name is Sarah Wasserman, and I'm currently an assistant professor of English and Material Culture Studies at the University of Delaware. And at the University of Delaware, we also have this center called the Center for Material Culture Studies, of which I'm currently the associate director. And it's a really interdisciplinary hub where people in the humanities come together to talk about stuff. And that is what my research has been on, broadly speaking. I just put out a book called The Death of Things, Ephemera, and the American Novel. And we're going to talk about that book, so I won't, say too much about it in detail now, except to say that as I'm moving on from that book, in some sense, I'm also really interested in the confluence between literature, material culture studies, and media studies. And yeah, I work on contemporary American literature, basically 1945 until today, and that's also the focus of the book.
Yeah, great. I mean, that title, The Death of Things, in Ephemera, an American Novel, is almost the death of things is almost a gloss or a definition of what that word ephemera might mean, in a way. But I wondered if you might expand for people who are new to this kind of concept of ephemera, particularly in an academic sense, as to what it means and why we should care so much about it, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It is one of these terms that people sort of sometimes, I kind of know what it is, but what is it really? But before I define it, I have to tell you, it's funny you bring up the title, because I first of all couldn't believe that The Death of Things wasn't a book that was already published. It felt like a title that should be out there. But also I had, when people would read the manuscript, and this relates to the definition, they would say, is that really the right title though? Because you're not talking about the death of things. You're talking about things that are dying, but never quite dead. And so I was sort of called out for having this misnomer of a title, but I stood by it because I found it poetic enough. And, I'm interested in these things that, as you said, disappear or vanish. And death is another term for that, because disappearing things so often remind us of our own finitude and our own mortality. But ephemera, traditionally speaking, it actually comes from a Latin Greek hybrid word. So epi, like in Epicurus, means upon or on, and hemera actually means a day. So originally the term was used to refer to the mayfly, which only survives for one day. And then it's conventionally used to mean paper matter that isn't meant to last. So if you think about a calendar where you tear one page off every day, or broadsides, ticket stubs, pamphlets, things like that. And obviously in the book, I'm really interested in expanding that definition and how far can you stretch it, right? Pop-up buildings, world's fairs, city blocks under gentrification, where does literature allow us to push the boundary of that term is a question that interests me. But you asked a question, which is why should we study it? And there are big answers to that question, existential ones that we can talk about. But one very simple feet on the ground reason is because they actually are everywhere in the literature that interests me. And in other literature too, modernists will tell you they did it first, and early modernists will say, no, we did it first. But people writing stories and trying to figure out how to navigate this contemporary, ever-changing world often have these disappearing objects in those stories. And so that's where I started. I thought, these are everywhere, and I want to make sense of that.
And the books that you're talking about there that are really invested in particular, well, you look at a range of different things in the book. So sometimes small sort of paper objects, so what we might think of as traditional ephemera, so ticket stubs, these sorts of things. But then also, as you said, the grander things like infrastructure, shop signs, those sorts of things. Why do you think in literature from what would you call it, the modern American novel, I suppose? The
post-war American, yeah. Modern, we use different terms.
Why do you get a sense that they're so central to the kind of narrative arc, but also the rhetoric and the writing of these kind of novels?
Yeah, I think there's a historically specific argument to be made there, which is to say, post-war America was obsessed with disposable goods, ever more rapid consumer cycles, the new. We could talk about the iPhone as this current technological iteration of planned obsolescence and all of that. So I think one thing to say is that these novelists were trying to just give a realist account of the world around them, and that these objects were not just typical, but sort of quintessentially of that period in the United States because of our consumer habits. I think when you get beyond that, you start to get into something more affective, I guess is the word I would use. And writers are trying to figure out how to elegize all of these promises of America in the 20th century. It was going to be the greatest generation, we're going to have technological advances, plenitude, et cetera, et cetera. And the writers that interest me, whether it's Ralph Ellison or Don DeLillo, are trying to make sense of how to live in a world where those promises didn't come true. And they can almost load these objects or freight them with those broken promises and the feelings around them.
Mm. That sense of that makes me think about particularly you talk about this in particular with a couple of texts, I think, but that idea of time and progress, the idea that that in the 20th century in America in particular things are moving forward really, really rapidly, but the objects that you're interested in, these kind of ephemeral remains, they kind of puncture this sense of forward moving time. And I wonder if there's something interesting in what they do there to our idea that we're always moving forward, this kind of teleological idea of time.
I don't know if I can say it better than you. I mean, that's a great reading of what I'm trying to argue. But what I will say is something that's just odd and possibly drew my interest as well is exactly what you're talking about. So to take an example, in E.L. Doctorow's novel, World's Fair, which is from the 80s, but it's about the 1939 New York World's Fair. There's a scene in that novel, very long and extended, where the main character, who is named after Doctorow himself, goes to the fair for a second time. And everything is kind of fading and chipped and peeling. And the narrator is really cognizant that this is an ephemeral apparition or vision of the future, and it won't come true. So exactly as you're saying, we have crystallized in the object a rupture in exactly what the fair is supposed to narrativize about progress and futurity. And yet, that's almost, for me, one of the most beautiful moments in the novel. And it's not only because, it's melancholy and loss and lament, that there's some kind of curatorial impulse that Doctorow is working with that I think brings readers a lot of pleasure. The details, what does the paint look like? What do the colors look like? What does it smell like? That there's a kind of sensory experience that's also very appealing. And so it's not critique that just works in these novels by saying, oh, look, this is interrupted. It's critique that draws you in and is somehow seductive. And so you occupy it in a different way than you might in, a political text or a more explicitly political text.
And that, so you're talking about there about the real sensory, I suppose, engagement with material culture that the novels that you explore bring up. And I suppose that brings around the question about why the novel as a form is so good at both introducing us to ephemeral or exploring it, and I think in a way you're suggesting that it ephemeralizes some of the objects that we might not immediately think are temporary things. It makes things temporary.
Yeah, I'm curious about how you think about this too in your own work, because it's a question I get a lot, because you can imagine people saying, isn't the poem better? It is itself of an more ephemeral form. Or isn't a play better because it's in time and so it's performed? It is itself temporal in the way you're talking about. But I think the novel, and I write about this a bit in the introduction, but the novel becomes a container or a storage medium for ephemera that we can't get at in another way. And what I mean by that is, if I show you this, like this is actual ephemera from the New York World's Fair, right? And if I show you this, we're like, yeah, cool. And we have the object, right? And we can learn a lot from it. We can appreciate it, but we have the object. So the sense of loss is not the same as when a novelist has to write about it. So the novel becomes an interesting storage medium that can capture both the details of the object itself, those sensory things, and its loss. I also think that many of the novels I write about, whether it's Pynchon or DeLillo or Ellison, all of these big men, right? They are trying to create monuments out of their novels. And so I'm interested as well in the tension between the novel as a form, which we think of as the most monumental in literature, and yet we always wonder if it's dying now, and the kind of materials they put in those novels. It's again another one of these conflicts that produces something, I think, for the reader.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that idea, to go back to when you were talking earlier about, so Doctor revisiting the World's Fair and sort of realizing that this idea of a future is perhaps not as glossy as it might seem. One of the things that I found really interesting about the theories of ephemera that you laid out is ways of getting at people's experiences that are not necessarily the dominant political narrative or the narrative that politics wants to sell you, particularly about the 20th century. So I don't know, I wondered if you could say a little bit about how attention to things that disappear in the 20th century, or perhaps in any other, might allow us to get to the histories that have traditionally been marginalized or not told, not explicitly told in the ways that we might want them to be. Why are things so good?
It's such an important question. And I think because my book is largely about canonical literature, it can seem like that's a question that I'm less attentive to. But I think one of the things I've tried to do in this project is precisely what you're saying, which is to attend to these stories that are themselves sometimes fleeting, or they're on the edges and you have to look a bit differently to access them. So I don't think it's as simple as saying, minor objects, minoritized subjects, or something like that at all. And I don't want to make it seem that pat, but I do think, a couple different things about this. So one is that there's a tendency to think that because something is temporary, and whether that's an object or a movement, a protest, that it is less politically efficacious. And I'm interested in the ways that literature can mark the traces of those things that might not be as visible otherwise. And it's not to say, if you have this story about ephemera, somehow now you've created a lasting political movement, but that there is a kind of access to orientations to the world, to the state, towards other people, that becomes legible, I guess, through these vanishing objects, as strange as it sounds. That people who don't have access to dominant or dominative orientations toward the world are often doing very political things. They're just doing them in different ways. And actually, a lot of these novels that I look at have moments of that really interest me. I will just say, as a kind of corollary to your question, the 80s and 90s, right, made it possible for us to study all kinds of things that aren't high literature. That got broken down, cultural studies, etc. And I do think that now we're seeing, there's a whole bunch of scholars, and I'm sure there are many in your field as well, who are looking at these kinds of archival materials that haven't been studied and figuring out what the stories there are. And that's across period and across fields. So it feels like a moment where scholars are really trying to find these other kinds of stories and forms of representation, and that ephemera is one place to go.
So with that in mind about and where you might go, I suppose, to recover these types of objects, although not necessarily objects. I mean, what you were talking about, I was just reminded of a few years ago in London, they opened a new the Design Museum, so a new version of the Design Museum. Anyway, and in one section of that, so it sort of runs through 20th century forms of design, and one section that it's got in there is protest design. So this is people sort of making T-shirts and banners and pennants and things. So real ephemera, things that are just to be used on a demonstration. But of course, displayed there with a kind of narrative that contextualizes them, that kind of makes them akin to the vessel of the novel in that sense, but here framed in a museum and a kind of institution. And I know one of the things that you're interested in writing about is this notion of the archive or archives. So the archive is this big conceptual sense of the material or written storage of the past, and then archives as kind of physical representations of them. And you kind of talk, and your coder in the book is interested in future versions of how we might store ephemera. And I wondered if I might kind of throw one of your own questions back at you, which is, well, the internet has kind of changed what we think of as things passing and moving, and but it also allows us to preserve things. So I wondered if the internet changes our relationship to things that might die or might otherwise die.
Yeah, so much there, because I also am fascinated by the museum exhibition of the protest materials. Maybe there's a link here that we can draw. So I myself feel like this question makes my brain hurt, because there are so many sides to it, right? So on the one hand, people say, especially I work with so many people who are curators and conservationists, and they would tell you, you have to have the real McCoy, as it were, that even if you're at the museum and you're having this encounter with the artifact itself, it will be infinitely different than if you encounter it digitized online. And that's not just because, you're in the room with other people and smells and sounds, that, it's a different kind of experience, but that something is to be learned from interacting with that object as an object, the grain of the paper, the smear of the marker, whatever we're talking about. And I think in my teaching, I find that to be very true with students, that, you take students to special collections because they have a transformative experience when they look at an object itself. And that's the one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is, as someone who is interested in all the meaning that we get from vanishing and from disappearance, I think there's so much to be learned and gleaned from, I guess if we're talking about, digitized ephemera. And the truth is, where the two sides of the coin might in fact be the same, is that ephemera don't come to you. So to go back to this, they don't come to you unless someone somewhere, and maybe it's accidental or maybe it's intentional, saves it, that there's enough care somewhere along the way to bring it to us in the present. And whether that comes in the form of a museum exhibition or a library archive or a digital, representation of that object online. And so I suppose for me, yes, it's changing, to answer the question. It's absolutely a different order of experience. And I think we're right now at a moment where just conceptually we feel like, well, the internet simultaneously makes everything immaterial and it saves everything. You know, I can never delete anything. My Friendster account from 1999 is still alive, and this video recording, all of these anxieties we have about not being able to delete. So conceptually, we're in that kind of tense moment. And my interest as a scholar, not just as a kind of person living in a digital era, is to figure out what both the forms of care that bring us these objects mean and tell us, and what are the forms of representation that make that care visible. For some objects, it might be the museum. But for some objects, it might be a very different kind of digital format. And someone whose work I think gets at this really well is Whitney Tratine, who is in early modern, and her project Cut, Copy, Paste about, you know, early modern fragmented books and making of books and how that relates to the digital, for me is a really great example of a scholar who understands there are continuities between analog and digital. There are differences, and it's in fact our job now not just to say, oh, they're different and I do one or the other, but to try to understand the relays between them. It's really hard work, but it's exciting.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, one of the things on one of the projects I'm working with, that we're interested in this tool called kind of Sketchfab. I don't know if you're familiar with it, where it kind of gives you 3D details of particular objects. And, you know, I don't know, that the kind of idea that looking at something in that detail on the screen, even digitally, might tell you something about it, but you're still having to kind of supplement it.
You probably feel like you come to know those objects better than objects that you only know in analog space, even if it's a very intimate object. It's the fact, you know, that you're doing all this work of translation, you know this thing inside and out and backwards and forwards, right?
Yeah, and the fact that you can, I guess, engage with something without the amount of care that you would have to take for an archival object, you know, where you can't just move it around and do what you like with it. And ephemeral
that's true, but I would ask you, don't you think it's a different kind of care? So you don't have to put on your white gloves and worry that like your Snickers crumbs are going to get on it, but you think about how much care goes into coding that object and you know, all the minutia that are attended to in creating its digital avatar. It's just a different kind of care. I mean, the real question for me, and now this gets sort of very trippy and avant-garde, is if that's our new relationship to ephemera or to objects, maybe more written broadly, what does the novel that represents that look like? And that's, I don't have answers for that. I mean, we're in that moment, and that's why it's, I guess, exciting to work on contemporary literature. Is you're always the first responder chasing after the moving target into the future.
And in fact, I mean, that kind of brings me on to another question that I wanted to ask, which is to do with, I guess, the political urgency of thinking about not just disappearing things, but things that stubbornly refuse to vanish. Not only are we in this kind of hyper-consumerist age, but is there a kind of politics of ephemera that feels particularly relevant now when we have people invested in kind of nostalgic senses of the 20th century and earlier?
Yeah, absolutely. And when we have a political slogan, right, that was "Make America Great Again," and we don't even have to talk about what that again means and who it's again for, but to talk about the nostalgia of the 20th century and how intractable it feels at times in this country and also elsewhere is important. I do think there were moments when I was working on this book or finishing it up and I thought, oh, I wish this wasn't so relevant. You know, writing about Chester Himes and Ralph Ellison and white supremacy and the ways that white supremacy and its attendant urban renewal programs were attempting to erase forms of community, felt like I could have been writing it about novels written last year. And so that chapter of the book is very invested in precisely what you're saying, right? Like what lasts, what vanishes, where does that get muddled so that we can't see the difference? I do think more generally thinking about the urgency of ephemera, to go back to this thing I said earlier about new or scholars doing the work now around ephemera. Someone's book that comes to mind is Derek Spire's book, which is actually a kind of 19th century book, but he's done the very rigorous work of looking at all kinds of ephemera from early Black conventions and Black organizers in the 19th century, and articulates this amazing argument about the definitions of citizenship that Black people in this country were articulating through these ephemera and through other, objects as well. And his point is, it's not a narrative about citizenship that maps onto the one we have. It's a different narrative, and it's one that's really only visible if you look at these documents. And I think there's a question to be asked there, which is, why ephemera then in particular? Why is it most visible, or why is it best visible there? And does it have to do, to go back to something we talked about earlier as well, does it have to do with the fact that living under, oppression and subjugation means that you want to articulate your most radical ideas in temporary form, and it doesn't make them less radical? So my suspicion is that if we can lean in, I guess, to transience, to temporary formations, and we can also investigate the kind of materials around that, we actually arrive at an orientation that's very different from the nostalgic one you're talking about. That can be a little surprising because people look at the objects that I work on, stamps. People get so excited about stamps. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not actually into stamps. Don't tell anyone. So the objects themselves can really spawn all this nostalgia, and then the narratives around them do the opposite work.
That's brilliant. I really like that. In fact, the thing I was going to follow up by asking is about a broad idea of a theory or movement of studying ephemera, and that phrase "lean into transience" I think is really brilliant in terms of how you might do this kind of work, not just in, so I'm someone who works across the 16th and 17th centuries, for instance, and so I wanted to ask you whether you would have advice or tips or encouragement, I guess, for people trying to do this kind of work in periods that aren't necessarily the 20th century, where some of these questions are perhaps they're really in focus because we're still so closely plugged into them. But these histories obviously go longer and deeper, and people are trying to do and doing a really good job of doing this work in much earlier periods, in the medieval period, for instance, where similar things attend the lives of Black people, of queer people in these periods. So ephemera also, I guess, it also occupies a similar position then. So I guess I kind of wanted to ask what tips you might give to somebody trying to do the kind of work that you're doing on the post-war novel for maybe another period and another form or genre of writing.
Good luck. No, I'm kidding. So I think there's so much amazing work that's been done on how to read for absence in the archive. I mean, Saidiya Hartman has taught us all these amazing lessons about how to look for what's not on the surface of an archive. I think this leaning into transience, if that's what we're going to use as a phrase, and thinking about it in earlier periods, is slightly different in that, I guess my advice, and this will be advice coming from someone in literature and literary studies, and then I want to flag that first. I think so many people get in front of an artifact, or they get in front of a image of an artifact, and I see this across periods, and they're so enchanted by the object itself, which is great, and I think it's an important part of the process. But what happens is there's a kind of hard limit at description. So people get stuck with these incredible objects. I'm thinking actually about I saw a talk about early modern lockets that had little pieces of bloodstained paper in them. I don't know if that's something you've ever heard about, but kind of relic jewelry in a way. And the object itself is only part of the story. That I think the really exciting work comes from trying to understand not just what the object is, what it meant in its context. Those are all really important steps, but to try to figure out why it means something now. I mean, why is this an interesting object? Why is it worth studying? What stories does it have to tell? And it can be very hard to authorize oneself to ask those kinds of questions, especially when there is this object there. It feels like my job is not to interpret. It's not to go off the beaten, path. It's to really work with this thing and live with this thing. And I think one needs to do that. But the really exciting stuff happens when you do get into the realm of interpretation and speculation, I would say. So that's less a tip of, how do you actually look for these things in the archive or something like that, and more a tip of just authorizing yourself to ask the big questions, even of the smallest objects.
Like that's very helpfully phrased. There we go. Yeah. Great.
It's scary to ask those big questions. I still feel like, who am I to be trying to spin some grand theory out of a postage stamp? But I think we're invited to do that by the work we do, and we have to do it rigorously and in an evidence-based way. But it's the work of imagination that the humanities invites us to do, and I think it's important.
And I mean, reading with a close eye on something like a novel anyway, I mean, it's sort of asking you to do that in a way, isn't it? And so you're following an imaginative thread that's laid out for you there. Yeah, and
maybe I find it's funny, and so in material culture studies and I guess other disciplines, they talk about close looking, and we talk about close reading, and I find that such an important distinction, because close looking sounds like, you look closely and then you sort of stop. You've looked, you've seen, you've done the descriptive work. And close reading itself is an act of interpretation to me. And so I would just say do both always. Look and read.
This feels like a good juncture to ask the question that we asked all contributors, which is about that idea of reading. So, as you know, we're called a bit lit, lit being short for literature. And so we asked contributors what that word means to them, or what they find of interest about that kind of term, how they play with it, what it means to you. So would you like to take on that?
I would. I'll do my best. I feel like I want to ask you, what's the bit part? It's just a bit of literature, like we're getting a kind of capsule version of some stuff here. Is it?
Yeah. Well, yeah, a little bit of literature, creativity, softening the edges of it.
Yeah, I could give a little bit of an answer, I hope. But I'll do it by way of a story, or an anecdote, I guess. When I was finishing, or working on the book, I guess, I had a manuscript review, and I had some scholars read my work in progress, and they were wonderful and so helpful. And towards the end of the session, one of them said, Sarah, I feel like at the end of the day, your book is really about empathy. Like, that's really what it's about. It's about care. It's about empathy. And there have been all these really important critiques of empathy, and especially empathy in literature, and this idea that if you read stories, you become a more empathetic person. So I just want to ask you before we end, do you really want to die on the hill of empathy? And I thought, well, I don't want to die on any hill, especially for academia, but I was really anxious in the moment. I thought, oh gosh, yeah, right, I shouldn't. Maybe that's wrong, and it's not about care, and I shouldn't advance this argument. And then, I went home, and after some time I thought, well, if I am going to die on a hill, actually, maybe it really is empathy. Like, the world would, in fact, be a better place with more of it. The question, though, is, can literature actually help us with that? And I think there's this pretty outmoded idea that I mentioned, that literature is this vehicle for getting us to care about other people, or about other things, or about the environment. And I don't think that literature is some magic capsule, magic pill that we can take that does that. But I do think that one lesson I've learned from working on ephemera in literature, about literature, is that no literature, and whatever that means to you, whether that's a film, whether that's a novel, a poem, whether it's an image, no literature comes into being without a lot of care. And so to be a good reader, I guess I'll use the word good, to be an attentive, to be a just reader, is to acknowledge and to reckon with the care that is in the object that you confront. So literature for me, I guess right now in this moment, there are all kinds of things it does that I could talk about, right? Like I like literature that makes me feel certain ways, or I like literature that is beautiful. And what does that mean? But for me right now, and thinking about these minor fragile objects represented in literature that wouldn't come to us in other forms, that literature is an endeavor in care. And so to be a good reader is itself also an act of care. And I think there's something deeply humane in that. And I'm not ready to give that up. I'm not ready to give up on this idea that if we attune to the care that literature presents us with, that we ourselves can be more caring.
Mm. I mean, I find that a very appealing kind of sense of what criticism is or should be as well. You know, that exactly as you phrased it, you know, to take care.
It's a very like sappy, sentimental version. And other people would say, well, that's the problem with criticism, is that's not in there. But I think most of us reading literature, there's something small and warm still beating in our in our bodies, you know, that's sort of positive and joyous. So I'm interested in the ways that even actually in texts that are really intensively politically critical, that's still there. It's why I want to read Invisible Man and not history textbook. It's one reason, at least.
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, before we end, I should say The Death of Things is available from University of Minnesota Press.
This is true.
Yep. On the website. Was there something else that you wanted to finish by saying? We've kind of come around to that literature question, but I don't know if there was something else that you wanted to throw into the mix before we say goodbye.
That's a good question. I'm just thinking about, you know, what your listeners might be interested in, or viewers, whatever we call this medium now. And I don't think there's anything in particular, except I will maybe say, just as a last sort of fun thing, because we talked about, you know, what is literature? And I said, is it an image? And I love the book's cover. This is an image by John Gerard, who's actually an Irish artist. He lives in Austria now. And he sort of went to Spindlethorpe, Texas, and did this installation where he made these smoke flags in this very kind of barren landscape. And he was kind enough to authorize me to use the photograph for the cover. And why I bring this up is I just want to say that oftentimes in working on ephemera and on literature, I have this feeling that the visual artists all got their way before us. And there are so many incredible, you know, paintings and sculptures and throughout the 20th century that get and touch on all of these concepts we've been talking about. So it's just to also, in thinking about your question, you know, what are your tips? I always think that cross-pollination and allowing the things that speak to you, even if they're kind of outside your wheelhouse of either period or genre or form, is really generative.
Yes, I think that's brilliant. What an encouraging way to finish conversation. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Colin. It's so nice to talk to you, and I can't wait to see what you're going to do with ephemera.
Yes, well, I've got plenty of ideas and avenues now to explore.
I'm so glad.
Speak soon.
Take care.